Nature is made possible by public television stations, your gas company and America's gas industry, bringing natural gas through 1 million miles of underground pipelines to 160 million people, fueling factories, heating homes, and cooking meals.
Hi, I'm George Page for Nature. There are certain places on Earth whose very names spark thoughts of legends, myths, and wonder. One is the highest mountain in Africa, Kilimanjaro. Immortalized by Ernest Hemingway in his short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, at 19,340 feet, it's the most majestic feature in a landscape already remarkable for its grandeur.
Although Ptolemy of Alexandria made references to a
snow-capped mountain in Africa as early as 46 AD, it was not until 1848 that German missionaries finally discovered the great mountain. But even after the discovery of Kilimanjaro was reported, geographers refused to believe there could be a snow-capped mountain so close to the equator. Since then, today's scientists and explorers have found the mountain to be even more amazing than the ancient myths and legends about it, as you'll see in our film.
Yama, amale elegonyu, ijua shangarna.
Ondonyi bor.
Ondonyi bor.
Ebai.
Enyo shire toto nation bai ana tatwa do gwejiti nation nyore toto nation bai elegonyu iti kopeni.
Era de road.
Oh.
Era de road ari.
Era de road ari.
Amba de bagang na bala duro. La duro.
Eri bega galere mok. Oh.
Amigru ngira ina da. Da hagu ina duru ngarambo.
Oh.
Nanangu ngarambo medu anako. Ije yogo donyi bor. Ejonde la na regi Swahili. Kilimanjaro.
Kilimanjaro, a volcano that rises 3 miles out of the surrounding African plain in monumental isolation. When not obscured by clouds, the glistening summit is visible more than 100 miles away. Yet the white mountain of the Maasai people kept itself hidden from the eyes of Europeans until the 1840s. Even then, scientists scoffed at the idea that water could freeze at the equator. They dismissed reports of snow by the first man to set foot on its slopes, Johann Rebmann, a German missionary. The leading writer of the Times on Africa, William Desborough Cooley, scorned the reports as travelers' tales. David Livingstone suggested that perhaps Rebmann was deceived by quartz crystals. The controversy raged for about 14 years until the German Baron von der Decken climbed to 13,000 feet and into a snowstorm. Then in 1889, Professor Hans Mayer of Leipzig reached the summit at nearly 20,000 feet. The elusive mountain had been conquered and would have to begin yielding up its long-kept secrets. These 19th century maps show Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, close to the Kenyan border, on the edge of East Africa's mountainous backbone, the Great Rift Valley. Kibo in the center, Mawenzi in the east, form the two summits of Kilimanjaro. Encircling the mountain, the vegetation has evolved into distinct ecozones, ranging from the plains to the summit. The main crater wall rises precipitously above the ice fields to Uhuru Point, the true peak. The crater is 1.5 miles across, much of it filled with glaciers and ice sheets. In places, fresh snow becomes compacted by wind and cold into extraordinary knee-high, razor-sharp structures called neige pénitente, snow in prayer, tilting in arcs to the equatorial sun. At noon, the air temperature is little more than freezing point, and the air itself is desperately thin, with only half the usual oxygen content. So these ravens that scavenge in the wake of the climbers cannot survive the night here. They must descend to more favorable climes. One of Kilimanjaro's riddles lies in its melting glaciers. Ice tends to reflect radiation from the sun, hardly melting, but this huge ice block was substantially larger in a photograph taken 3 years earlier. Gradually vanishing, chunks of ice are falling away, vaporizing to join the arid volcanic dust. Some say the snows of Kilimanjaro are melting as part of a slow warming process of the whole Earth, or that the increased heat comes from deep within the volcano's heart. As more of the rocks are exposed and able to absorb the sun's radiation, they melt the glaciers from below, torturing the ice into fantastic pillars and caverns. Within the main crater sits another, like a saucer inside a soup bowl. The saucer rim forms a complete wall around the inner crater, almost 3,000 feet across. At the center is the volcano's awesome throat. The sides are strewn with a blanket of ash and rubble from its most recent eruption, perhaps only 200 years ago. The pit is about 500 feet deep. Today, only volcanic ash trickles back into the volcano's heart. But millions of years ago, cataclysmic eruptions hurled out gigantic boulders, molten magma, and fire as Africa tore herself apart and the Rift Valley was created. But these events went unwitnessed by man, for he had not yet evolved. Steaming vents show that the volcano only sleeps, though it's a sleep from which it may never awaken. Like the breath of a dying dragon, the fumaroles emit rank steam and deposit yellow crystals of pure sulfur around their openings. Legend has it that the top of Kibo was the final resting place of Menelik, first king of Abyssinia, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. He wished to be interred with the seal ring of his father on this mountain of greatness. Whoever later claimed the ring, it was said, would inherit the wisdom of Solomon. Other legends insist the summit is scattered with precious stones of red carnelian. But there are no jewels, and the laval dust is barren and unyielding. Yet the rocks do provide useful minerals for the Chaga people who live on the lower slopes. After they've guided climbers to the summit, William and Francis collect salts from the inner crater wall, which they'll use in local medicines. Their clothing is protection against both cold and heat. By day, the sun is blisteringly hot, since infrared and ultraviolet rays pass unabsorbed through the thin air. But whenever a cloud crosses the sun, and at night, the cold is intense. A hostile place, the mountain gives no solace at this altitude. Beyond the crater rim lies the northern glacier. Like a gleaming city of ice, it is one of the many wonders of the mountain. No longer moving, its terraces and cliffs were once part of a massive system of glaciers. Forming and reforming over the millennia, they exerted phenomenal pressure as they ground the rocks beneath them, creating the smooth saddle that links Kibo Peak with the jagged pinnacles of its younger brother, Mawinzi. Local Chaga legend tells that Mawinzi's crater was blown off by Kibo in a fit of anger, when his smaller brother asked once too often for a light for his pipe. More glaciers occur on the southern side of Kibo. This is Fort Wangler, a petrified river of solid ice, hard as rock. Though melting a little by day, the water freezes again at night or evaporates into the wind. The ground is barren. Without enough warmth, oxygen, and water, it cannot support green plants. The plains below distant Mawinzi were once the home of Ernest Hemingway. In his book, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, he immortalized this rocky outcrop. Leopard Point, so called because in the 1920s, the frozen corpse of a leopard was photographed here. Why had it climbed to its death in this primordial landscape, where no animal can survive the night unaided? No one knows, but in a cleft in the rocks close to the roof of Africa, the leopard has its final resting place, its bones embedded in ice, like a sacrifice to the superior force of the mountain. But though the mountain shows no mercy at the summit, each day's descent will reveal its increasing variety and more benign aspects. Day 2 of the descent. The sun breaks over the outer crater wall, bringing a glow to the slopes. 30 miles west, the pyramid of Mount Meru shares the same warming rays. It seems to float in the sea of clouds that smother the plains around Kilimanjaro. To Arab slave traders, this was the enchanted mountain because they believed it could hide itself at will. Every morning, a pall of mist rolls up towards the icy dome to envelop the summit in a shroud that lasts through most of the day. On the rocky precipices outside the crater, the full wrath of a tropical alpine climate becomes apparent. By night, moisture from the air freezes solid in fractures in the rocks. As ice, it expands and cracks the boulders, exposing ever more of the walls to erosion. By day, the rocks are alternately heated by the sun and cooled by the drizzling fog, a relentless cycle that occurs every day, every year. On the southern side of the mountain is Arrow Glacier, formed from layers of snow that melt, freeze, and compact together. Since the layers are thick and the slope is steep, the glacier glides imperceptibly to its foot, 3,000 feet below the summit, where its progress is halted by melting and vaporization. Immense pressures have distorted parts of the glacier into bizarre Gothic patterns, while layers of dust-bearing snow have added to its surfaces over the centuries. The dust contains nitrates, freed by lightning from the atmosphere. They're vital nutrients for plant growth. At the lower edge of the snowcap, some ice melts during the day, and cold meltwater containing dissolved minerals starts its journey to the plains. The first true vegetation zone is the alpine desert, and here there's some evidence of animal life. A dead eland that came to these heights to feed or to seek out soda salt, but succumbed, perhaps to the deadly chilling night. Or was it taken by wild dogs, descendants of those that threatened explorer Wilfred Thesiger further up the mountain? Among the shyest of the antelopes, eland are migratory. They crisscross the mountain slopes below the snow line to search for fresh growths of soft plants that are high in protein but low in fiber. Throughout the morning to midday, clouds from the east, sometimes carrying snow, cross over the saddle as they mass up towards Kibo's brow. Shelter is limited in the alpine desert. Any bird that visits these heights must seek refuge among the rocks from the relentless wind and sun. Tiny spiders and insects are shielded by mosses and ancient lichens. Where the soil is exposed to the climate, regular designs are discernible. Alternate freezing and thawing sorts the rocks and pebbles according to size as they flow down the mountain in the process called solifluction. What little rain falls here gathers along the fissures, where one or two herbaceous plants manage to gain a tenuous foothold. Pioneering grasses grow, anchored beneath the sheltered side of rocks or rooted between underground stones. In a strategy for survival, stunted plants clump together to conserve water and heat and to protect their young shoots. Once its roots are established, an everlasting flower can spread out to colonize and stabilize more of the volcanic ash. Stiff white petals give this helichrysum some protection from the sun's ultraviolet light, and silver felting on the leaves helps delay the otherwise wilting effect of the early morning sun when the still frozen roots cannot yet pass up water to the rest of the plant. Eland tracks sink deep into the laval dust. These antelope are large, almost the weight and size of a buffalo, but with smaller faces. Francis and William guide climbers up to Kibo once a week. Because of the frequent climbs, their bodies have adapted to high-altitude oxygen deficiency. They cross the saddle, walking towards Mawenzi, as afternoon turns to dusk. Day 3, and a third of the way down the mountain. As soon as the overhead sun strikes the rocks, they heat up, melting the undersurfaces of adjacent ice sheets. For as long as the sun shines, life-giving water seeps from the boulders, and the plants are released from their nocturnal prisons of ice. Fueled by the rays of the sun, the rhythm of the day quickens. Streams and rivulets cascade down the mountainside, continuing a process of erosion that over millions of years has cut through solid rocks to create valleys and ravines. One valley on the southern side is called Karanja. It's 6,500 feet below the summit, 10,000 feet above the plain. It marks a boundary between the arid alpine zone above and the damper moorland. Though the variety of plants living here is limited, they show some amazing adaptations to their demanding environment. Grasses and flowers are taller now, and bushes make their first appearance. In damp places, spikes of the giant lobelia spiral up to 6 feet as they pass through their cycle of budding and flowering. The little hill chat uses the flower stalks for perches and as a plentiful larder of food because a number of small creatures live inside the lobelia. The hill chat copes with a drop in temperature by fluffing up its feathers. Since they nest here at 13,000 feet, they need extra protection when the rocks cool to sub-zero temperatures at night. They bring soft mosses and lichens to help insulate the brood, which hatch, like robin chicks, practically naked. Until they flower, giant lobelias grow close to the ground, their leaves forming rosettes that close up tight at night. A liquid is stored at the base of the leaves. It contains both water and a viscous fluid secreted by the plant, probably some form of antifreeze. Where there's shelter from the wind, pink everlasting can grow as stalked flowers, but they still have paper-thin blossoms and leaves with a bloom of silvery hairs for protection from the sun and against water loss. More bizarre even than the giant lobelias are these giant groundsels. They grow slowly to as much as 20 feet. Top-heavy, ungainly, their giant form has been suggested to be the result of a mutation caused by exposure to high levels of the sun's ultraviolet rays. Dead leaves cover and protect the stem, and the green leaves close each night, enfolding the shoots. This keeps the inside of the stem, where water is stored, above freezing. Giant groundsels, or senecio, are members of the ubiquitous daisy family. They're very closely related to a multitude of other kinds of senecio found in almost every climate. Some small versions grow in Karanja that are little different from groundsel weeds and ragworts and have many flowered heads that produce a plethora of seeds. The end of the day, a cold, damp fog embraces the valley, a depressing prelude to the chilling night. By dawn, the fog has condensed and frozen on each exposed leaf blade and flower head. For these delicate blossoms, there's never a respite from the frost, for every night they're plunged into the grip of midwinter. After sunrise, a boggy moorland reforms below the saddle as the sun unlocks the earth. In muddy places, needles of ice created during the night melt and sink back into the soil. Their disappearance is seen over a few hours as they churn and sift the soil during solifluction. Pink-stemmed lady's mantle, mosses, sedges, and grasses grow on the wet, peaty moorland. Rich pickings are found by the hillchat among the mosses as spiders and insects start to emerge from a night spent in a state of suspended animation. Living close to the chats, but with different needs, are rats with short tails and ears. They make their burrows in the lady's mantle and feed hurriedly, for by day birds of prey, such as this bearded vulture or lammergeier, inhabit the mountain moorland. The vulture feeds mainly on carrion and on marrow from bones it smashes open by dropping them from a great height. This place is known as Last Water. On the route to the summit via the saddle, it's the final source of water. This haplocarpa is another member of the daisy family, pioneers that colonize areas of poor soil, stabilizing the earth and thereby adding to the variety of the vegetation. Night returns and ice reforms on the grasses. The soil freezes, and an amazing process not filmed before takes place under the secrecy of darkness. Finger-long needles of ice rise up out of the soil, like figures in a horrible nightmare. Shira Plateau on the western shoulder. The mountain throws off another of her veils to reveal yet a different landscape. A herd of eland crop the grasses and herbs with the softest leaves. Their selective diet means they must lead a nomadic life. Shira is the remnant of a volcanic crater. The rest was engulfed by a lava flow during one of Kibo's eruptions, part of the upheavals that produced Africa's Great Rift Valley. "8,000 feet below the summit, the mountain changes its character completely. The first tree-like plants appear, thickets of heathers 12 feet high. They bear the simple rolled-up leaves of their smaller relations. A chameleon, harbinger of the better climate at Kilimanjaro's halfway point. At 8,000 feet, a girdle of evergreen trees surrounds Kilimanjaro, growing on dry, sandy soils. On its upper fringes, the heather grove is a spindly thicket with myrtles and umbrella plants, and in open places, giant lobelias. Halfway below snow-clad Kibo, the climate is no longer extreme, but fairly warm and humid by day, cool and damp by night. Festoons of the lichen old man's beard hang from the heather branches. They gather their moisture from the ever-present mists. Now, as tall as a forest, heather trees grow to a height of 40 feet. Their giant form is probably a response to the demands of high-altitude living, and they provide shelter for a shrub layer of ferns, begonias, and brambles. Still further down, and the forest becomes truly tropical, with African rosewoods up to 65 feet high. Decaying litter gathers on the twisted branches, and mosses, ferns, and flowers take root above ground level. Damp and dark, dense and still, this hothouse is the moss forest. Many kinds of plants have evolved here into unique forms. Related to our garden impatiens, this is the Kilimanjaro balsam, a species found only on the mountain. The white-necked ravens that follow the climbers up and down the mountain trails are usually seen in pairs. They eat anything, from scraps and carrion to wild berries and the mountain's rats. And they can live anywhere, from mountain cliffs to forest edges. Highly intelligent, they can also be affectionate. Clouds return, and the landscape is once more enfolded in a misty embrace. Between 6,000 and 10,000 feet, evergreen rainforests cover the mountain. On the southern slopes, springs emanating from the glaciers above are common, while the forest traps the water like a vast sponge and releases it slowly but consistently to the lower slopes. After the rigors of the higher altitudes, the forest is a restful place, a sanctuary for wildlife. This handsome black and white colobus monkey is now protected within a national park, which stretches from the tropical forest right to the summit. Often, the colobus are seen close to people's homes. They're not above raiding local gardens. Living in close harmony with the mountain are the Chaga people. The forest provides them with fodder for their cows and firewood. But their main activity is the cultivation of the slopes that were once lowland rainforest. Now they're farms and homes. William and Francis, like other Chaga men, inherited small parcels of cultivated land called shambas. Most families keep a milking cow inside a hut. They're no longer allowed to take their animals into the forest to graze, and they have no pasture of their own. Kilimanjaro's friendly lower slopes attracted the pastoral Chaga long before the coming of the Europeans. They settled and became farmers, selling food and for a while slaves and ivory to traders who used Kilimanjaro as a landmark. Europeans, however, influenced some of the cash crops that are now grown. Potatoes and beans, along with more than 20 kinds of banana, are cultivated on the shambas. The wild ancestor of another cash crop originated in East Africa's highlands, coffee. The best coffee grows under the shelter of large trees, planted as a long-term investment for their timber value as well as for shade. The streams that flow from Kilimanjaro's glaciers and forests enable the Chaga people to provide their crops and livestock with water all year round. Tamed by channels and culverts, the water is seduced into fields of maize. School children are taught the basics of agriculture as part of their curriculum. Under the supervision of their teachers, they clear the scrub land and plant a crop of cabbages. A simple enough exercise, but part of a highly organized agricultural system developed by the Chaga. They have a substantial system of permanent cultivation. By layering their crops under the thinned-out cover of what was once dense lowland rainforest, they have imitated some of the natural ecology of a forest. "16,000 feet below the summit, the vast plain, the savanna, is fed by springs that owe their origins to the Great White Mountain. Without it, there would be no water. Here on the northwest side, the waters flow into a lush green meadowland that stretches for many miles along the foot of Kilimanjaro. This rich oasis is Amboseli, parts of which sometimes become a vast lake. It too has been designated a national park, a sanctuary for the wildlife attracted to its swamps from the arid grassland beyond. Simply by staying still for most of the day, buffalo are able to keep cool. They're seemingly ponderous ruminants, but when provoked, they're dangerously quick-tempered. As they crop the waterside vegetation, the channels they create encourage the plants into fresh growth. By contrast, hippopotamuses doze in the water during the day, digesting the harvest of their previous night's foraging. They're wasteful feeders, and a jacana, or lily trotter, is able to use their leftovers as a raft to hunt for food. The hippo's droppings enrich the water so much that fish and other small animals are abundant. By casting its shadow on the water, a pelican can see if any fish lurk beneath the surface. With so much food readily available, the fish eagle needs to spend less than a quarter of its day hunting over the swamps. To the Maasai, each new day brings unchanging duties. Their way of life revolves around their cattle. The day begins and ends with the needs of the herd. The small, docile cows are led from the thorny pens where they've spent the night. With donkeys and goats, they'll be taken from the overgrazed areas to fresh pasture and water. Their departure is supervised by the old chief, or Maasai. Countless generations of Maasai cattle have scarred the light volcanic soil and worn its surface into a tracery of paths with but one destination, the oasis of water in the shadow of the mountain. The journey is about 4 miles, and the water is shared by domesticated and wild creatures alike. They use the hole at different times of day, and confrontations are avoided. The water rises to the surface through a deposit of meerschaum, German for sea foam. It's a light, absorbent mineral that's mined for pipe bowls. The water is alkaline and foul-tasting, but the goats and other livestock thrive on it. Goats, like cattle, are herded mainly for their milk. And while the cattle have decimated the grass cover over much of the Maasai lands, goats have plundered the acacia bushes and other leafy vegetation. There are few permanent watering places on the plains, but those there are serve as beacons to the animals. Every few days, elephants trek from the fringes of the thorn forests where they forage to a swamp in Amboseli. They cross open land with the unhurried assurance their vast size confers upon them. A troop of baboons follows in the wake of the giants, picking at droppings for undigested seeds. For them, the open ground is threatening, and they scurry across to cover. Giraffes browse the acacia trees to a regular height of 16 feet. Though their food is tough and thorny, it contains most of the moisture they need, so they don't have to drink every day. But elephants require over 25 gallons of water at a time. Without it, the relentless sun will sap their energy and their ability to survive. An elephant's blood is circulated through vessels in its ears, where it's cooled by as much as 10 degrees. The young lions are resting now in the late afternoon breezes. they'll use the cool of the evening for their next hunting expedition. For now, zebras may pass unmolested to the waterhole. Though not always clearly visible, the great mountain is ever present under its cloak of clouds. After drinking and feeding, all the livestock are rounded up before nightfall and its dangers. Spirits are high among these Maasai boys. The nearness of the Earth's largest land animal tempts one youngster to test his manhood. But elephants rarely seek a confrontation with man, and the Maasai threat is merely a bluff. The Great Plains of East Africa trace their origins to that time of volcanic upheaval when the Rift Valley split and Kilimanjaro was born. The land was repeatedly smothered by the volcano's outpourings of molten rock. And as the earth cooled and sank, grasslands appeared where before there had been forests. The scene was set for the evolution of herd animals and for the emergence of man. In the shadow of Kilimanjaro, both farming Chaga, who have settled with ease into the 20th century, and pastoral Maasai, who have resolutely maintained traditional ways, have evolved their distinctive lifestyles.
Anja na gana itu bulu amu, mera ilkeja ko itu ogi, enkai yake. Engi jabe subu kamo subu na, ine duri ruzala mei. Afi, ele mwangu kwa kia bangi na bulu. Kia kola lari, orage be agwa lari nega balen.
Nowhere else on Earth could a journey of less than a week encompass natural conditions ranging from those found at the poles, through those of a tropical forest, to those found only on an equatorial savanna. Knowing it better only makes Kilimanjaro more mysterious, more awesome.
Africa's great mountain does not reveal its secrets easily. It took 41 years after its discovery for anyone to scale its peak. And almost 100 years later, our film crew had some rough moments during the 10 weeks of shooting. Several of the crew became ill at the summit and collapsed before they became acclimated to the lack of oxygen. But even though we now have seen some of the mountain's secrets, Kilimanjaro emerges as majestic as ever, a fitting crown to East Africa's magnificent plains. I'm George Page for Nature.
Nature is made possible by public television stations, your gas company, and America's gas industry, developing new sources of gas energy and ways to use gas more efficiently for more than 160 million people across America.
Next week, we travel north to Europe to the mouth of the continent's most celebrated river, the Blue Danube. Danube Delta, our film next week on Nature.
For a transcript of this program, send $3 to Nature Transcripts, Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. Please be sure to include the title of this particular program.